Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. You may remember that a few weeks ago we were taking the temperature of conservatism in Britain. Well, today, after George Galloway's by-election win in Bradford and his derisive comments about the collapse of socialism in the Labour Party, it seems a good idea to do something similar for the left. Tristram Hunt is a historian who's written on the rise of socialism in British cities and a life of Marx's collaborator Friedrich Engels. He's also a Labour MP. Janet Daley, an American trained as a philosopher who's lived here since 1965, is a conservative commentator currently for the Sunday Telegraph. Martin Rowson's cartoons appear in The Guardian, but also across a huge range of left-wing publications. He's just updated Gulliver's Travels. But we're going to kick off with Alwyn Turner, a writer whose new e-book, Things Can Only Get Bitter, deals with what he believes is a missing generation of left-wing politicians and therefore left-wing politics. Alwyn, you say that this is really all to do with the 1992 election, which was the election where John Major surprised the country, or a lot of the country, by returning to power.
I think it is. I think I start from... I probably ought to declare an interest. I'm 50 years old and this kind of colours my thinking on some of this, but it starts from the 2010 election when I discover that the country is now being governed by people who are younger than I am. I'm aware that this is obviously a common aspect of growing old.
And cabinet ministers, like the policemen, keep getting younger.
Like policemen and then ultimately High Court judges, they get younger than you. But it did seem to me that there had been a jump here from a generation of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown into David Cameron and the Miliband's, and there was a gap in the middle. And on further investigation, it turns out this is not simply the perception of getting old. This is actually a real phenomenon that between people born between the years of 1955 1964, that decade.
So that brings me into... I'm 52, so that brings me into the cohort.
They are massively underrepresented as cabinet ministers, and particularly as senior cabinet ministers. There is a gap there. And
how many people did from that particular cohort are or have been right at the top of politics, Alwyn? I mean, Jackie Smith, I think, is of that generation.
The four great officers of state and deputy prime minister at that level, there were three altogether. There's Jackie Smith during the New Labour years, and there is currently William Hague and Theresa May.
That is a very small number of people.
It is, and it's already exceeded by the next generation, born in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's not as if this is a generation waiting to happen. It has already passed by. It's a particularly numerous generation because this is part of the biggest population bulge in British history. And it's not a noticeably untalented or uncommitted generation. It's, if anything, is probably overrepresented in the media and in what politicians like to call the cultural industries. And it seems that something went wrong there, and I think it's to do with that experience of that generation. So
you went back, you said, OK, so there is this missing generation in politics, particularly from your perspective on the left, and you then asked yourself, why is it missing?
Indeed, that's
and you look at this 1992 election as a sort of seminal moment.
I think it's the ultimate moment. It starts with a generation that comes out of school and out of college into the mass unemployment of the early 80s, and whose adult experience is of a long series of defeats for the left, which culminates in the 1992 election, when there was a genuine feeling that actually this was going to be a different election this time round, that the long Tory rule was going to come to an end, and it didn't, and it felt like the final kick. And I think for a lot of people, that was when they lost faith in the idea of political parties actually producing any change whatsoever. And people turned their backs on politics and started to create a cultural revival that I think is actually genuinely interesting as a piece of cultural history.
So they became rock musicians, they went into television, they became stand-up comics.
Yeah, there's a huge boom in what had been the alternative culture of the 1980s that had been submerged and had been a counterculture to the dominant ideology of Thatcherism. Suddenly becomes mainstream and goes overground, and it is, yes, it's comedy, it's the arts, I mean the visual arts particularly, it's the music, the movies, fashion. There's suddenly a really quite exciting cultural moment, but I think it's at the expense of politics.
Is there something childish about this, in the sense of I'm a protester, I'm a cultural renegade, etc., etc., etc. Lots of people kind of posing as outsiders in the arts, in comedy, and so on, but with no political agenda actually at the centre of things. It's as I say, childish.
I think there's an element of that, and I think actually there's also a conscious element of childishness. I mean, this cultural period in the early 90s is when the new lad phenomenon is born, which is created by 30-year-old middle-class men who kind of resent the fact that they didn't have a proper adolescence in the traditional sense, because they were at college at a time when feminism was a dominant ideology. And at the age of about 30, they think, hang it all, we might as well go back, get very drunk with our mates, watch some football and eat takeaway pizzas, and that'll be fine.
And we can do it ironically.
We can do it ironically, and we can have the adolescence that we never had.
Right. Because the other thing you might say about this period is that although the left was just constantly defeated, both inside the Labour Party and in parliamentary elections, when it came to cultural norms, as people would say, when it came to attitudes to gay people, to gender and all the rest of it, there was a sort of leftish or progressive consensus that became increasingly powerful.
In the 90s, not in the 80s. In the 80s, you see a rebellion against that. You see the government, particularly on gay issues, the government has decided that this is the weak link in the chain of the permissive societies. It's seen this is where we can attack, and we can roll back the gains made in the 1960s. And you see by 1988, when Section 28 of the Local Government Act is passed, that's the same year that the arrests of men for homosexual acts is greater than it was 30 years earlier, when all homosexual acts were actually illegal. The police are joining in with this campaign, and if you follow the British social attitudes surveys, public attitudes towards homosexuality get more hostile. And reach a peak in 1988. And it's only the 90s when that is reversed, and that is one of the positive functions of the turn away from politics into culture, that actually it's culture that leads that, not politicians. Politicians are running in the wake of the cultural
Just before I open this up to everybody else, one final question. To what extent is the turn away from politics not just about parliamentary elections, but about a sense that there isn't a coherent ideological alternative either? After sort of Tony Benn and Bennism and the alternative economic strategy and all those ideas from the 1970s, and after the failure of the miners' strike, to a lot of people, it didn't seem as if there was a coherent socialist alternative anyway.
I think there's an element of that, but there was, apart from the Benn concept of the left, there had emerged in the 1980s the Livingston version of the left, which was still a viable possibility. And I think the first mayoral election with Ken Livingstone in 2000, when he was outside the Labour Party, and swept very convincingly through London, suggested that there was, at least in London, possibly not in the rest of the country, because I don't know that Livingstone ever reached beyond London much, but there certainly was an alternative there.
All right, what do the rest of us think about this? Let's start with Tristram Hunt, because you are a Labour MP as well as a historian. Do you recognise this missing generation when you look around the benches?
I think it's a very, very interesting study, and I hadn't seen it in that way before. I mean, I think it's rather familiar in a sense as well, because there is this old story of how, as it were, culture diverts people from politics. In terms of Victorian history, it's this lovely phrase of deproletarianisation. Basically, why the working classes didn't rise was because they all started reading tabloids and going to football matches and enjoying horse racing, and so this culture, in a sense, diverts them from their inherent radicalism. But I think in terms of the sort of the crisis, as it were, facing socialism at that period, what's interesting is, in a sense, not just 1992 but 1989, and this notion that the traditional Marxist vision of socialism was beginning to fade away. And to my mind, that opens up all sorts of exciting ideas, which we're dealing with at the moment.
Less exciting, actually, than the ones that had gone before. That's the trouble. I mean, my thesis is that it wasn't, forgive me, but it seems to me your interpretation is a bit parochial. There was a major global event that occurred in the early 1990s, not to do with the John Major election, but to do with the fact that communism had collapsed. And it collapsed in a particularly ignominious way, with a sort of bloodless whimper. People just literally walked out from under it. And when they walked out from under it, we discovered what had actually been going on behind the wall and what had been going on in this totalitarian society, which had replaced the temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, had turned into the permanent dictatorship of a corrupt political party. Now, that was deeply disillusioning and disorienting. You didn't have to be a communist, you didn't have to even be a fellow traveller to start questioning the whole notion of the command economy, the collectivist solution as opposed to individualist solutions. And what happened was that the whole of the left had to start thinking very hard. The more sensitive, imaginative people on the left started thinking, is there an ideological war any longer? Labour reinvented itself. Suddenly, free market economics was the only game in town. Even China, now still officially a communist country, has gone over to free market economics because it does create wealth and prosperity. So what happened? You ended up with a really rather unexciting argument to contradict Tristram's point. What happened was that the brightest and the best no longer had an ideological war. They just had a rather fiddly argument about how you manage a free market economy. How much do you regulate it?
But it seems to me this is based on a rather narrow parameter of what socialism is. And socialism has been around for a very, very long time. And a particular statist model of socialism, which was the late 19th, 20th century paradigm of socialism, reached its end. And what's exciting at the moment, and what we're dealing with at the moment, is to think about non-statist forms of socialism. And that tradition is rather invigorating to my mind.
I think that's... Okay. Sorry, go on.
Martin Rowson.
Well, I mean, I was just going to echo Tristram's point there about this was a very narrow definition of what socialism was, because a Stalinist edifice collapsed in 1992. It should have been an opportunity for the Trots suddenly to triumph, but in fact they dissipated somewhere else. People went off into the Green Movement. But of course, the methodology of Leninism survived in New Labour. Most of the ideologues of New Labour were former Trots, former members of the CP, who ditched the ideology but took the centrally controlled freakery of New Labour, because this generation, this missing generation of people on the left, were actually prevented from getting anywhere by New Labour.
But that was
just a minute. An obvious example of this is, for instance, Mark Seddon, who should have been a rising star in the Labour Party. He was the editor of Tribune, he was taking all the right ways, and he was prevented time and time again from standing for safe seats by New Labour. But also a final thing is, I mean, when I was reading Alwyn's book, I just kept on having this phrase going through my head, which is, of course, politics is showbiz for ugly people, with great respect for Tristram. I mean, there is an alternative
probably the most
to
handsome person sitting around.
He is. But there is always an alternative to doing politics. It's doing life, actually.
But speaking as somebody who was a Trotskyist, believe it or not, in the 1970s, I can tell you what happened to all those Trotskyists. They'd gone into the alternative culture, and they'd also gone into what we used to call boring from within, not boring in the sense of tedious, boring in the sense of boring like a drill, boring from within the institutions. They went into the culture life, they went into local authorities, they went into teaching, a lot of them went into teaching and academic life. They decided against professional politics, and they went into an alternative culture. And the word alternative is central to this, because if you're an alternative comedian, for example, the great advantage is that you don't have to offer an alternative. You don't have to present an alternative society. And it was the idea of a real ideological alternative that was lost. It's now fiddling around with the management.
I want to come back to Alwyn at this point and say, do you recognise that it was a collapse of an idea around the world was also very important to this missing generation of British politicians?
It's certainly, clearly, obviously massively important. I think the immediate impact of the collapse of communism in Britain was on the Conservative Party rather than on the left, I have to say. I mean, I think it changed the nature of how they viewed Europe, which is a separate argument. But previously, the Conservative Party had been all in favour of Europe because it was a bulwark against socialism. Once communism had collapsed, it was suddenly reinvented that Europe was socialist and therefore it could be opposed.
That's interesting. So the first crisis was inside the Conservative Party, and indeed in the government of John Major, whose 1992 election we started talking about.
Indeed. I mean, that dominated the entire 92 to 97 government, was the conservative arguments over Europe, which stem from the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But I don't think that's why people decided not to become involved in politics, because I think if that were the case, that would also apply to the next generation of people who were very much involved in politics and were at that stage. People like David Cameron were involved in the 92 election.
Can I just introduce one other name that we haven't put in here, which is that of Neil Kinnock, because he was recognisably a kind of socialist of a Labour Party tradition, coming out of the sort of Bevanite part of the Labour Party in Wales and struggling to reconcile that tradition with free market economics and how much you could have the command economy, and above all, how you dealt with militant trade unionism in this country, and how important was his failure to become elected, and his failure to articulate something that reached to the English middle classes, really, part of this.
A lot of the decline of the left is there during Neil Kinnock's later period as leader. I think the control freakery that Martin's talking about is already in there. I'm sure it was during Kinnock's time that the regulations were changed on the Labour Party conference. So instead of the National Executive Committee sitting on the stage and speaking from the platform, it became the shadow cabinet. That move from the movement into the leadership.
Yeah, I can remember the bits of paper being handed out saying, to shadow cabinet members at the time, saying you cannot give interviews or speak to members of the journalists until it has been cleared with me, and me being the, in those days, rather beautifully mustachioed Peter Mandelson.
Indeed, it was part of that. A centralising tendency was there.
Martin Rowson.
But another point is the actual collapse of politics in general. Once you assume the primacy of the market, then politics has no real role because it can't do anything, because only the market can do things. And in fact, Major's victory in 1992 was the last time the Tories won a general election. They haven't won one since. Didn't win the last one. And I remember, as a cartoonist working on a daily and weekly basis, tracking that 92 government. And it was... I did a cartoon at one point called Everlasting Nemesis, with Major on the rack saying, "Don't worry, readers, I can take this kind of thing," almost infinitely, because it was just disaster after disaster after disaster. And they tore themselves to pieces over ideology, as you said, over Europe. And so, in a way, it's not just the left that's missed out, it's the whole of politics.
I think there's an extension that once those who have turned their backs on politics move into culture and become dominant in culture, and they start to control the ideology of the country through that, it leads to a turn away from politics generally. So that between the 1992 general election and the 2010 election, 6 million voters go missing from the two major parties.
But we shouldn't think necessarily...
Many of them go missing from the electoral register altogether.
Culture and politics are totally disconnected, because actually political decisions affect culture. And the fact that, what we've all sort of, talked about disparagingly about message control and political leadership, actually delivered a Labour government in 1997 very effectively, began free entry to museums and galleries, allowed people to experience culture and understand culture, extended educational opportunities, all sorts of things which we can, worry about the NEC speaking from the platform and worry about, shadow cabinet ministers having to get sanctioned to talk to the Times. That doesn't matter. What matters, to my mind, is what you achieve if you get into government. And the fact of the matter is the trauma of 1992 was actually to make sure that the Labour Party and the Labour machine focus itself on getting into power and delivering real results for people.
I want to pick up on that and just see if we can push it a bit further, which is there seems to be a paradox, which is that everybody agrees that socialism collapses. If socialism collapses, why is it in this period of drift to the right, if that's what's going on, that we actually have the state growing bigger and bigger and bigger, that we have something which has been labelled and possibly libelled as political correctness becoming stronger and stronger and stronger? Don't we have, in effect, a soft cultural socialism which replaces state socialism in many respects, and is the product of all this missing generation of politicians who are in the cultural world?
But it's liberalism rather than socialism, I would suggest. You can have a soft liberalism which affects political culture and political discourse.
Not economic liberalism.
Not neoliberalism.
Apart from, I just want to make the point, this is radio, so we can't see Tristram moving his hand in exactly the same way as Tony Benn used to when he's making a point.
I was hoping for Roy Jenkins.
It's again this sort of sublimation of achieving anything politically, because everything is subject to the dictates of the market, because the market rules everything. This is the neoliberal gift from the neoliberal god.
Oh, hang
and
on.
therefore, political, because you can't control the economy, you try and control everything else instead. Because if you're a politician, you're there to do something. And the sort of control freakery of New Labour was a displacement activity. So they were trying to control everything because the really big, important thing, they said, it's nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
Now, you would agree with that, I think.
Yes, I would,
Daley.
that last point, yes. But what was most interesting about this was not a return to free market sort of economics in the Adam Smith sense. This was a return to a globalized market. And that is very serious because it means that effectively the market and what determines most people's lives and individual prosperity and so on is out of the control of democratic governments. And that is the really serious problem of the moment. Europe is making this wild, vain, manic attempt to do something about that, to pretend that there can be governmental controls, although they're supra-governmental controls. They're removing democracy quite forcibly in a couple of countries at the moment because democratic accountability has gone out the window. It's the globalization of the market economy that might mean that democratic politics has become an irrelevance.
I mean, I agree with what Martin Janet has suggested to an extent, and I think it is a valid criticism of New Labour and the Labour Party in office that we essentially accepted a Croslandite model of redistribution, i.e. we took the great riches from London, the South East, the City of London, and we redistributed. In Stoke-on-Trent, first new hospital for 140 years. The problem is that was then done on a very, very narrow tax base, and it also didn't address some of the structural inequalities and structural imbalances in the British economy. And now that's the discussion we're now having.
I need to impose a bit of structure here as well. So I want to come back and look one last time at the effect of all those people who left politics and went into the cultural industries, if that's what we call them. It's a strange phrase. What effect did they have, and how did they have it? Because this is very sort of central to your book, isn't it, Alwyn?
I think the early 90s is a really interesting cultural renaissance in Britain, where there is some very exciting work being done, and the move from the alternative into the mainstream, from Channel 4 to ITV, effectively. This is actually really quite exciting.
So give us some examples.
I think. Most of the book goes through a series of key moments. There's the Jack D show, which starts on Channel 4, and then he starts doing adverts. The first alternative comedian to front a major advertising campaign, which seemed to go against the concept of alternative comedy. Jack D managed to make that leap while still retaining his original audience.
And why does that matter? That matters because it makes people start to think differently.
Because within that there is still a residual political element. There is still certainly what the liberalism that we were talking about. That's an inherent part of it, and it starts to become much more powerful because it's expressed through culture rather than through top-down politics. There is also a residual anti-Toryism, which is very powerful, and which is one of the main reasons why the Tories were out of office for so long. Why Tony Blair was so successful, because Tony Blair then, when he becomes leader in 1994, recognises the power of this cultural renaissance and commandeers it for himself and associates himself with it.
You get those parties with Oasis hanging around.
And you get the rebranding of Cool Britannia. You also get the rebranding of the Young British Artists, and noticeably they didn't produce anything quite as interesting after that branding as they had before. And you get the rebranding of New Labour, and the whole thing becomes an advertising campaign and loses the energy and the vitality of it, and is, by the mid-90s, is already much less interesting than it had been.
Tristram, if that big cultural change is happening, a lot of people would say that what the Labour Party failed to do at that period, becoming entranced by the glamour of the market and so on, is start to think about the deep structure of the British economy and therefore British society. That they were simply taking the money coming from the city after it had been deregulated, spending it on welfare and so on, and not thinking enough about old-fashioned sounding things like an industrial policy.
Absolutely, and I think on the one hand that criticism is valid. On the other hand, we should not forget that the result of that was lifting all sorts of people out of poverty. And I was talking to a NHS manager the other day, and he'd worked in the NHS since 1969, and he said the only time the NHS has been properly funded was between 2001 and 2008. So actually, we can make this criticism in terms of not addressing some of the structural imbalances in the economy, but there were very marked achievements doing it. But now, what we're thinking about is political economy in its largest and most interesting sense, because that model has in a sense passed. We realise there's not much money left now. So what do we think about? We think about the cooperative tradition, the mutual tradition, all these elements of the Labour story which go back before the statist model. And at the moment, it seems to me a very exciting time. So when we think about socialism today, okay, yes, 1989, yes, 1992, but also 2008.
If it's a very exciting time, why are so few people members of the Labour Party? Why is it that in a place like Bradford, the Labour Party thinks it's going to have a good by-election win and then just gets absolutely smashed to one side?
A shallacking. I rather like that Barack Obama word. Because you have the battle of ideas, and if you go back to Keith Joseph and Institute of Economic Affairs and monetarism, all the rest of it, actually you're having that debate 5-6 years before you're having the political outcome. And it seems to me what we're doing at the moment, hopefully it'll be on a slightly shorter time frame, but having the battle of ideas now. But you're right, we haven't then turned that into identifiable political capital.
Janet Daley.
You're forgetting one very, very important factor. The reason that Tony Blair got back into office and that it was New Labour as opposed to Labour is because it had to reinvent itself in the face of the enormous popular success of what you could call aspirational politics. The class war, which kept an awful lot of people locked into the concrete of their origins, the class loyalty idea had completely gone out the window. Tony Blair used to talk about Mondeo man. He used to say that the lower middle class people and the striving, aspiring working class people didn't want to be talked to like that anymore. They didn't want a party to say, stay where you are and we'll look after you. And the consequence of that was that a great many people emerged from the fatalism and the passivity and the defeatism of what had been British working class life into something else. And that was the secret of New Labour's success.
And I think there's an interesting element of that in terms of Labour politics today in the South Asian community, and whether we've taken votes and identities for granted and talked down to people and not listened to aspirations and concerns, albeit in a different framework now.
It's almost as if, Martin Rowson, we're now in a situation there where the right or free market conservatives, whatever, have control of the economic levers. And have had for a very long time, but the penalty they must pay for it is being mocked by the popular culture and not liked by the sort of satirical popular culture. There seems to be a division of spoils. The left gets the cartoonists and the satire, and the right gets the levers.
We're very happy with that.
Well, there is a part of politics which we're ignoring, which is, of course, I would say the noblest part of politics, which is not about usurping or seizing power. It's about thwarting it. It's about actually mocking it and trying to keep it in its place. There will always be people who will seek to impose their will and autonomy on other people and run their lives, and there's up to the rest of us to try and even out the equation by pointing out they have rather ridiculous noses.
But I thought you were criticising the right because it didn't run people's lives. The whole left proposition has been to run people's lives.
I'm talking
to liberate.
About, anybody who aspires to the position of Prime Minister of this country is seeking to control other people's lives. Anybody involved in politics is seeking to do that. In the sort of primitive communist ideas of total equality, that wouldn't happen.
So, Alwyn, is it part of your contention then that these people who've been missing as cabinet ministers, or even as shadow cabinet ministers, that generation, the brightest and the best, have gone into being cartoonists for the Guardian, getting involved in filmmaking, in music, becoming stand-up comedians and so on. But by doing that, they have actually changed this country pretty radically.
They have changed it, probably not as radically as one might have anticipated that they would do so. It has proved to be a very great generation for commentators and for mocking from the sidelines, which is as Martin says, a very honourable tradition and one to be encouraged. And
it is honourable. Though, as Boris Johnson said when he left, well, he partly left journalism. He was entirely when he left journalism, but carried on taking the money. No, I didn't say that. He said no one's ever put up a column to a columnist. which was going back to my idea, is there something slightly childish about a generation who are the commentators? It's all right, we're the commentators. We're not the doers.
Yes, there is. There is a certain element of opting out and of shirking responsibility. But as I say, Martin is perfectly right. This is a very honourable tradition. Mocking is necessary and important. Otherwise,
also, can I just say, stand up for journalism? If you look at politician journalists, there's Trotsky, there's Churchill, there's Michael Foot. On it goes.
I'm very glad you mentioned the words Michael Foot, because I do want to bring in your book, Martin, which is a reworking in graphic novel form of Gulliver's Travels. Swift being Michael Foot's greatest hero, and Michael Foot being one of your greatest heroes. So there's a sort of element of fealty in this book. But it's clearly a very angry book, which takes a modern Gulliver through a sort of New Labour world of double-speak and bilge and a lack of a real economy. And I read my way through it, and I was coming to the Houyhnhnms, who in Swift are the sort of good guys, as it were, the civilised horses in many respects. But even there, your vision is quite black.
I think, Andrew, that you are, like most people in the last 150 years, misreading the last book, that dark last book of Gulliver's Travels, because the Houyhnhnms, or however you choose to pronounce it, well, I was thinking the other day, is hewn, a noise of wounded Houyhnhnms. The Houyhnhnms are pure reason. And the point about Gulliver's Travels is that Gulliver, the clue is in his name. He's gullible. He's not an unreliable narrator. He's an idiotic narrator. And he takes these creatures as pure reason, as a sort of the most admirable thing imaginable. But, of course, they're not human. And in the original, there's a description of how when...
They're horses, we should say.
Horses, yeah, they're horses.
Who don't know the...
When Gulliver is deported from the land of the Houyhnhnms, he leaves in a coracle made from the cured pelts of young yahoos. Now, yahoos are human beings. And that is a modest proposal, which is... Swift's famous pamphlet where he said that the starving Irish should eat their children. And so he's saying that, people are disgusting and vile and very physical and irrational, but they're people. These purely reasonable, rational creatures are not people. And Swift loved humanity. He didn't like individuals, but he loved humanity. And... I was in fact originally inspired to do this book when Princess Diana died, and somebody said, as they often do at such events, this marks the death of satire. And the death of satire has been marked so often. I think the only real time it could have died was when Henry Kissinger got his Nobel Peace Prize, when reality outstrips anything satire could possibly do. But I had to actually then, I started doing it in 1997, but I had to wait for the full tragedy of New Labour to unfold itself.
It is. It's a very, very vivid and very dark book in many ways, and of course the same was true of Gulliver's Travels when Swift wrote it. Does a satirist have to have a positive vision anywhere? I'm not saying it should be in the appendix to this book, saying, and life would be better if. But can it all be negative? Should it all be negative?
Part of the joke is the blackness of it.
Yes.
Black comedy is a very noble tradition. People have been saying to me throughout my career, why are you so cynical? I'm not cynical. I'm just a frustrated idealist who's constantly disappointed by reality. And I think the same was true of Swift. I mean, he was disappointed by the reality of people's bodies. That's part of his scatological vision, which we won't go into at this time of Monday morning too deeply, but I have reflected it in my book.
Yes. And when it comes to cartoonists, would it be true to say that the cartoonists who then start to propagandise for a positive vision of one kind decline as cartoonists?
Well,
I'm thinking of someone like Cruikshank, who becomes a great campaigner for teetotalism and rather sort of serious moralising cartoons, which are nothing like as funny as his old ones.
Well, yeah, the Woody Allen syndrome, as they say. It was. Well, Cruikshank is an interesting case because he was a truly great radical cartoonist in his early 20s as the heir to Gilray, and then sort of 50 years later, longevity always counts against people. He was doing this temperance stuff, but of course, the ironies interweave everything. And when he died, he left his wine cellar to his secret second wife. So there are all sorts of weird stuff going on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Tristram Hunt wants to come in. You've opened the book.
I have.
Page, I noticed.
What I enjoy about this book so much is more broadly that the rediscovery and re-energisation of the 18th century as a period of radicalism excitement. For so long we've been taught of the 18th century as this sort of dull age of equipoise and just Wedgwood China and all the rest of it. And actually what you see coming out of this book in terms of the homage to Swift and all the rest of it is the sort of edginess and terrifyingness. But my fear, Martin, is you're in a sense, this has taken this period because of you could be trapped in a sort of New Labour mindset. This is where your sort of deep inner fears and loathings are going to be based for so long. So I'm worrying about your career future if this is just going to be.
Tell you, no, don't worry, Tristram. It's an occupational hazard of all cartoonists that we suffer from a kind of Stockholm syndrome, where we fall in love with our victim/captors. I mean, I remember in 1997, I rang up my friend Steve Bell and said, "How do you feel about Major going?" He said, "I've lost my reason for living because of the underpants on the outside." He used to love doing those underpants, and I loved New Labour as much as I despise them, and I despise this government as much as I love them. I love drawing George Osborne.
Yes, we should explain to people that Tony Blair appears a great deal in this book. Janet Daley, one thing I wanted to ask you is, there was then that long period of New Labour rule. Do you think people on the right, Conservative people, sort of gave up on politics in any way, like socialists or Labour Party people gave up?
They had a collective nervous breakdown, and that was to do with an obsessive self-flagellation. They had their entire wardrobe stolen rhetorically by New Labour, and at the same time were overwhelmed by what they assumed to be the sort of hatred, which was this satirical hatred that was aimed at them, and didn't know how to find any new definition. They still haven't, frankly, found any new definition. I'm talking about the official Conservative Party, not the right, in a broader sense, not in an intellectual sense. And this is a fairly serious problem because it means nobody is having a proper argument. The people Labour isn't capable of producing a systematic alternative, and the party, supposedly in more or less nominal power, doesn't know who it is anymore. And that is very, very serious. It's not very inspiring for anybody who's inclined to go into politics.
This is very interesting because it picks up directly from Martin Rowson's point on the other side. If he and critics of New Labour from the left had a kind of strange, perverse admiration for Tony Blair, or at least an obsession with him, wanted to draw him, were mesmerised by him.
It's quite Freudian, some of this.
The same is true, it could be said, of people in the current government, on the other side, using the Peter Mandelson playbook to get into power.
Rather badly, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the thing. I mean, they've taken the manual, but they haven't actually replaced... the thing that was so arresting about Blair as a phenomenon, as a political phenomenon, was that he created the manual, he and Mandelson, and created the manual, and Alistair Campbell, but they just took the rhetoric wholesale. They took the rhetoric about aspiration, about individual achievement, about personal prosperity, whereas the Tories are actually in a more incoherent position because they've taken the playbook, as you say, the manual for how to do it, but they don't actually have a very clear idea of what it is they're trying to do any longer, and neither does anybody else.
I want to pick this back up with Alwyn Turner because it does seem to me that the great irony that your book is dealing with is that we've got this missing generation who go from politics into culture, and that period is dominated by a politician, Tony Blair, who actually plays politics as a cultural figure. He says, yes, I am Prime Minister, but I'm the guy with the air guitar. I'm the guy with the jeans and the Oasis parties, and really think of me as a cultural figure as much as you think of me as a traditional politician.
That was a recognition on his part that the culture was much more vital than the politics at that stage. And I do think that is true. I mean, on the right, it's this generation produces... Again, great commentators. I mean, Charles Moore, Dominic Lawson, Simon Heffer. These are people who are outside the Conservative Party, arguing that it's not a true Conservative Party, in the same way that the people on the left are arguing that the Labour Party has betrayed its own roots as well. The criticism of what has become, in that great 90s phrase, plagiarism, is still there.
But we shouldn't think that that's anything new. If we look at Buttskillism in the post-war years,
Indeed,
you can have that conjunction. But also, again, culture and politics are interconnected. You know, Stanley Baldwin was as much regarded himself as this cultural figure, this identifier of England and the countryside and all the rest of it. Gladstone chopping down his trees, those postcards of him done. I mean, all politicians, all successful politicians, hijack the zeitgeist, attach themselves to it, use those cultural phenomenon, whether it's Oasis or Blur or Young British Artists, all the rest of it, and the most successful ones tap into it and use it very effectively.
And I think, I mean, Tristram makes a very interesting point. And I think what we're going to see at the moment is that I don't know what the zeitgeist is. The Tories have tried to create the zeitgeist with austerity, but it doesn't really.
Oh no, that's an anti-zeitgeist.
It's democracy. It's the democratisation of culture through the new media.
And you quote Spike Milligan on this rather well, I think.
Indeed, yeah. One day the don't knows will win, and then where will we be?
And
they have won.
You've absolutely seen that with getting rid of the current head of the Arts Council, because there is this fear that they haven't got, as it were, what that cultural legacy of Cameron, what their cultural message is, and they need to impose it top down.
And also, I was saying this to another cartoonist the other day. The cartoonists are having fun with this government because it is inherently ridiculous having a coalition of opposites, not opposites, but
They're very close together.
Yeah, and it's just a sort of it's like a sitcom. But there are no impressionists who do any member of the government. Rory Brennan was asked, can you do Nick Clegg yet? And he said, Nick Clegg can't do Nick Clegg yet. but I would have thought Cameron would be perfect for an impressionist. There are no impressionists who do Cameron. So he hasn't even actually managed to infiltrate himself into the kind of the collective psyche of the nation.
So is it the case that the country has decided to carry on trying to earn its money on the right and dress on the left?
Yeah, I think so. And there is just genuinely a loss of interest in politics. The fact that 6 million voters have gone missing from the two main parties from 92 through to 2010 seems to me massively significant. And most of those have just disappeared altogether off the electoral register.
Well, if any of those 6 million people are listening, could they please make contact, and we will put you back in touch with parliamentary politics in due course. Thank you to all my guests: Tristram Hunt, Labour MP and historian; Janet Daley, Conservative commentator; Alwyn Turner's Things Can Only Get Bitter is available as an e-book, great title; and Martin Rowson's Gulliver's Travels is a real book, and a graphic one at that, and they're both out now. Next week we're going to be talking about the age of science and curiosity with the novelist Peter Carey, with Rebecca Stott and Philip Ball. But for now, thank you and goodbye. If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try some others, such as The Forum, the discussion programme about global ideas. And to find out more, visit bbcworldservice.com/forum.
Is now being governed by people who are younger than I am. I'm aware that this is obviously a common aspect of growing old.
And cabinet ministers, like the policemen, keep getting younger.
Like policemen, and then ultimately High Court judges, they get younger than you. But it did seem to me that there had been a jump here from a generation of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown into David Cameron and the Miliband's, and there was a gap in the middle. And on further investigation, it turns out this is not simply the perception of getting old. This is actually a real phenomenon that between people born between the years of 1955 and 1964, that decade.
So that brings me into... I'm 52, so that brings me into the cohort.
They are massively underrepresented as cabinet ministers, and particularly as senior cabinet ministers. There is a gap there. And
how many people did from that particular cohort are or have been right at the top of politics, Alwyn? I mean, Jackie Smith, I think,
as
is of that generation.
The four great officers of state and deputy prime minister at that level, there were three altogether. There's Jackie Smith during the New Labour years, and there is currently William Hague and Theresa May.
That is a very small number of people.
It is, and it's already exceeded by the next generation, born in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's not as if this is a generation waiting to happen. It has already passed by. It's a particular
musicians. They went into television. They became stand-up comics.
Yeah, there's a huge boom in what had been the alternative culture of the 1980s that had been submerged and had been a counterculture to the dominant ideology of Thatcherism. Suddenly becomes mainstream and goes overground. And it is, yes, it's comedy. It's the arts. I mean, the visual arts particularly. It's the music, the movies, fashion. there's suddenly a really quite exciting cultural moment, but I think it's at the expense of politics.
Is there something childish about this, in the sense of I'm a protester, I'm a cultural renegade, etc., etc., etc. Lots of people kind of posing as outsiders in the arts, in comedy, and so on, but with no political agenda actually at the centre of things. It's as I say, childish.
I think there's an element of that, and I think actually there's also a conscious element of childishness. I mean, this cultural period in the early 90s is when the new lad phenomenon is born, which is created by 30-year-old middle-class men who kind of resent the fact that they didn't have a proper adolescence in the traditional sense, because that they were at college at a time when feminism was a dominant ideology, and at the age of about 30 they think, hang it all, we might as well go back, get very drunk with our mates, watch some football and eat takeaway pizzas, and that'll be fine.
And we can do it. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. You may remember that a few weeks ago we were taking the temperature of conservatism in Britain. Well, today, after George Galloway's by-election win in Bradford and his derisive comments about the collapse of socialism in the Labour Party, it seems a good idea to do something similar for the left. Tristram Hunt is a historian who's written on the rise of socialism in British cities and a life of Marx's collaborator Friedrich Engels. He's also a Labour MP. Janet Daley, an American trained as a philosopher who's lived here since 1965, is a conservative commentator currently for the Sunday Telegraph. Martin Rowson's cartoons appear in The Guardian, but also across a huge range of left-wing publications. He's just updated Gulliver's Travels. But we're going to kick off with Alwyn Turner, a writer whose new e-book, Things Can Only Get Bitter, deals with what he believes is a missing generation of left-wing politicians and therefore left-wing politics. Alwyn, you say that this is really all to do with the 1992 election, which was the election where John Major surprised the country, or a lot of the country, by returning to power.
I think it is. I think I start from... I probably ought to declare an interest. I'm 50 years old, and this kind of colours my thinking on some of this, but it starts from the 2010 election, when I discover that the country numerous generation, because this is part of the biggest population bulge in British history, and it's not a noticeably untalented or uncommitted generation. It's, if anything, is probably overrepresented in the media and in what politicians like to call the cultural industries, and it seems that something went wrong there, and I think it's to do with that experience of that generation.
So you went back, you said, OK, so there is this missing generation in politics, particularly from your perspective on the left, and you then asked yourself, why is it missing?
Indeed, that's
and you look at this 1992 election as a sort of seminal moment.
I think it's the ultimate moment. It starts with a generation that comes out of school and out of college into the mass unemployment of the early 80s, and whose adult experience is of a long series of defeats for the left, which culminates in the 1992 election, when there was a genuine feeling that actually this was going to be a different election this time round, that the long Tory rule was going to come to an end, and it didn't, and it felt like the final kick. And I think for a lot of people, that was when they lost faith in the idea of political parties actually producing any change whatsoever. And people turned their backs on politics and started to create a cultural revival that I think is actually genuinely interesting as a piece of cultural history.
So they became, ironically...
We can do it ironically, and we can have the adolescence that we never had.
Right. Because the other thing you might say about this period is that although the left was just constantly defeated, both inside the Labour Party and in parliamentary elections, when it came to cultural norms, as people would say, when it came to attitudes to gay people, to gender and all the rest of it, there was a sort of leftish or progressive consensus that became increasingly powerful.
In the 90s, not in the 80s. In the 80s, you see a rebellion against that. You see the government, deliberate, particularly on gay issues, the government has decided that this is the weak link in the chain of the permissive societies. It's seen this is where we can attack, and we can roll back the gains made in the 1960s. And you see by 1988, when Section 28 of the Local Government Act is passed, that's the same year that the arrests of men for homosexual acts is greater than it was 30 years earlier, when all homosexual acts were actually illegal. The police are joining in with this campaign, and if you follow the British social attitudes surveys, public attitudes towards homosexuality get more hostile and reach a peak in 1988. And it's only the 90s when that is reversed, and that is one of the positive functions of the